Chapter 1. Can I trust you with my heart? I first met Scott Peterson on November 20th, 2002, at the Elephant Bar in Fresno, California. It was a blind date. My best friend, Sean Sibley, had set us up, and I got there before he did. I took a seat on a bench in the glass-walled foyer within view of the walkway, and every time someone approached, I looked up. I had butterflies in my stomach. I had a feeling my life was about to change. Scott Peterson sounded absolutely perfect. Sean had met him at a convention in Anaheim. She had been very impressed. Scott was intelligent, good-looking, and very funny, and he seemed eager to settle down. "Do you think there's a special person that you meant to be with forever?" he had asked Sean. From anyone else, the line may have seemed like a come-on, but Scott was different. Sean had told him that she was in a committed relationship, and he never once made a single flirtatious comment, never once tried to cross the line. At the end of the business day, she and Scott joined a few people for drinks and dinner. At one point, he joked about putting the words, "horny bastard," on his business card, thinking it might help him meet women, but mostly he behaved like a perfect gentleman. By the end of the evening, Sean had a plan. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. "Who?" Scott asked. "My best friend." Sean called me the next day to tell me all about Scott and to ask if she could give him my number. I was full of questions. "What did you say about me?" I began. "That you were beautiful and a good person," Sean said. "What was he like? Is he nice? Is he cute?" "Very cute, and he couldn't be nicer." "And he's serious?" "Very. He said he was looking for someone special, and he asked if I knew anyone who was interested in a committed relationship. And I thought of you, of course." I didn't hear from Scott for several weeks, and when we finally connected, he couldn't have been sweeter. He asked if I was free for dinner the following evening, and we made plans to rendezvous at the Elephant Bar. "How will I recognize you?" I asked. "Well, I'm not very tall," he said, "and I have long greasy hair and a big loose belly." "That's good," I joked back. "I'm real tall, and I weigh about 160 pounds. "Really?" he asked, laughing. "No, not really," I said. "I'm thin and small-framed, 5'7.5" with blonde hair." "Good," he said. "Then it won't be a problem if I walk up to every attractive blonde in the place and ask if she's Amber." Shortly after 6 on the appointed evening, Sean came over to stay with my baby daughter, Ayana. "Just remember that I have to be at work tomorrow morning," Sean said, only half joking. "Don't worry," I said. "I know." I arrived at the Elephant Bar with time to spare. At exactly 4 minutes after 7, as I sat waiting for Scott, a man approached and made eye contact. I thought it might be Scott. He sort of fit the description, but I had a bad feeling about him. Please, God, I thought, don't let it be him. I looked away, and much to my relief, he moved through the foyer and disappeared into the restaurant. In my heart, a moment later, another man approached. In my heart, I knew and hoped that this was Scott. He was a shade over 6 feet tall, in good shape, and he was wearing a well-cut suit. He stepped through the glass door and lit up when he saw me. "Amber?" "Scott," I replied, getting to my feet. He leaned close and gave me a small peck on the cheek. "Am I late?" I'm sorry I'm late." "Not at all," I said. The plan had been to meet at 7 in front of the Elephant Bar and to go to dinner from there. So we left and made our way to the parking lot. "I was a little nervous about meeting you," Scott said en route, but he didn't look nervous to me. He was smiling, and he seemed somehow relieved. "Can I ask you a favor?" he said. "What?" "I've been in this suit all day. Would you mind very much if we went to my hotel so I could check in and shower and change?" I didn't mind. It seemed reasonable. I left my car in the parking lot, and we got into his Ford truck and drove to the Radisson in downtown Fresno. When we got there, he began to unload his things. There was a big green lockbox in the cab of his truck, and his luggage was stashed inside. Scott looked at me sheepishly, as if embarrassed. "Look at all this stuff," he said. "I practically live out of my truck." We went inside and took the elevator to a room on the top floor. Scott put his luggage down and reached into a brown duffel bag and pulled out a bottle of champagne. He smiled, and I found myself thinking he had a very nice smile. He popped the cork and proceeded to pour each of us a glass. Clearly, this was a man who planned ahead. Scott had a sip and turned on the radio and excused himself and went off to take a shower. I nursed my champagne, singing to myself to pass the time. When Scott emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, he was wearing black slacks and a clean white t-shirt. He went off to get a blue dress shirt and was still buttoning it up when he rejoined me. I was wearing a black skirt and a blue top. "We match," I said. "So we do," he said. Then he seemed to remember something. He reached into the duffel bag again and pulled out a box of strawberries, and he dropped one into each of our glasses. I watched the champagne bubble up around it, and I had another sip and looked at him. He was smiling again. It was a warm, friendly smile. When we finished our drinks, we left the hotel and went to a Japanese restaurant on Shore Avenue. We were led to a table, but Scott immediately excused himself. He returned a few minutes later to say he had arranged for a private room. He led the way over, and we took our shoes off and stepped past the sliding bamboo door. The room had one table, low to the ground, and we sat next to each other on the floor. In no time at all, we were in the midst of drinks and dinner, and our conversation flowed easily. Scott told me all about himself. He said he was a fertilizer salesman, that his travels took him all over the world, from Cairo to Paris, and that he lived alone in Sacramento, in a big 1940s single-family home. "I'd love to have pets, but I travel so much it wouldn't be fair to them," he said. I told him that I hadn't traveled much at all, but that I hoped to someday. "I know this sounds crazy," I said, "but when I was in junior college, I took 2 years of Swahili." "I don't think that's crazy at all," he said. "I think that's very cool." Scott told me he had acquired a taste for wine and that he belonged to several wine clubs. This impressed me. I like good wine myself and have always wanted to know more about it. "I have a nice collection of good wine at home," he said. "Every month the various clubs ship me a few choice bottles." As the evening progressed, Scott said that he was looking forward to settling down, but that he hadn't yet found the right person. The way he looked at me when he said that made me feel he might be wondering whether I was that person. Then I told him about my work as a massage therapist. He seemed genuinely interested and asked lots of questions about my clientele, hours, and techniques. I told him that business was good and that I was on the verge of going out on my own. I was working at a place called Backworks, but I was in the process of making arrangements to take a larger space at American Body Works. As for my personal life, I admitted that I'd had my share of unhappy relationships, but that there was one very bright spot in my life, my daughter, Ayana. She was 20 months old that very day. Talking to Scott was easy. He told me about his mother, Jackie, who was ill with chronic bronchitis. He said he had a condo in San Diego which was fully furnished, with a Land Rover in the garage, and that he was thinking of selling the entire package. "I never used the place," he explained. "I found a couple who are interested in buying it just the way it is, including every last stick of furniture and the Land Rover." As I listened to him, I grew more and more impressed. I thought, this guy is hard-working, ambitious, and he makes a good living. He really has potential. We also talked about the coming holidays. Scott said he was going to be fishing in Alaska over Thanksgiving with one of his brothers, his father and an uncle, and that he'd be spending Christmas in Kennebunkport with his family as he did every year. After Christmas, he would be going to Paris with friends to celebrate the New Year, and then he'd take a week or two to do some business in other European cities. I said I'd be spending Christmas with some close friends, a married couple I call the Bensons. "They're like a second family to me," I said. I told him that my parents had divorced when I was 5, and that there'd been a lot of drama and a lot of back and forth when I was a kid, and that my mother was remarried, and my father had been in a relationship for a while. At one point, as we were finishing dinner, he put his hand on my back, a quiet, pleasant gesture, and said he was really enjoying the evening and would like to see me again. Everything felt natural. I felt a nice connection to him. "When are you going to see me again?" I asked. "Sounds like you're going to be gone for a long time." "Not that long," he said. "I'll be back before the end of January." That was as specific as he got. Suddenly, the hostess came in to tell us that they were getting ready to close for the night, and we were the last two people in the restaurant. She could see we weren't done talking, so she suggested we go next door, to the karaoke lounge. We went over, and Scott ordered a pair of gin and tonics. Not that we needed them. And he told me we should get up and sing. "No way," I said. "I'm not getting up in front of people. I'm too shy." "Come on," he said. "I heard you singing in the hotel room when I got out of the shower. You have a beautiful voice." He really wanted to get up there and sing, and he kept pestering me, but nicely. And I looked around and noticed that there were only a few people left in the place. So I said yes. We decided to try our luck with Islands in the Stream, which has two parts, male and female. And we launched in. We were terrible. I was laughing so hard I could barely catch my breath. But Scott kept singing, so I played along. When the song was over, I apologized to the patrons for our performance. A couple of them actually clapped at this point, and we began to make our unsteady way back to the table. But a Frank Sinatra song came on, and I felt like dancing. "I'm not a very good dancer," Scott said. "Don't worry," I said, "I'll lead." I was pretty tipsy by this point, so we didn't really dance much. We just sort of stood there and swayed. It was nice, though. It felt good, just being close to him. When we went back to our seats, Scott looked at me and asked if I was a smoker. "No," I said. He leaned over and kissed me. "Oh yeah," he said, "you are definitely not a smoker." A few minutes later, the lights went up and we realized it was time to go. We got into his truck and drove over to the Food Max for a bottle of gin, which we also didn't need. Then returned to the Radisson. I was in no condition to drive home, so I went up to his room. When we stepped inside, he turned and kissed me again, somewhat more passionately this time. "I don't know if I'm ready to be with you," I said, but my resistance soon faded and I ended up spending the night. I liked him. I could see myself falling for a man like Scott Peterson. In the morning, early, Sean called me on my cell phone. She didn't ask any questions, but she reminded me that she had to go to work. We got dressed and Scott drove me back to my car, which was still in the Elephant Bar parking lot. There was a ticket on the windshield, and I gave it to him. "Here's a little memento for you," I said. I wasn't feeling all that good about myself, and about having spent the night. And I guess I was trying to be funny. But Scott didn't seem to think it was funny. He looked very serious. "I really want to see you again," he said. "Do you want to see me?" "Yes," I said. "I do. I guess I just feel a little weird about last night. It felt like a one-night stand, and I don't do one-night stands." "It wasn't a one-night stand," he said. "I know we just met, but I think we really connected. I really like being with you, and I want to spend more time with you and get to know you better. I'm sorry I have to leave town so soon." "Will you call me?" "Sure," he said. "I'm not real good about phones, but I'll try." We kissed goodbye, and I got in my car and drove off. I didn't look back. I felt certain we would see each other again. I got home and told Sean that I'd had a very nice evening, but she didn't have time for details. Then I took my daughter, Ayana, to preschool and made my way back to Backworks. Scott called later that day. He had gone to a meeting and was passing through Fresno again, and he wanted to come over and see me. But I was tired and I had more clients that afternoon. He said he understood and promised to call again. The next day, Scott called and left a message. "I'm kicking myself," he said. "I wish I could have seen you at least once more before my trip." He called a couple of days later to tell me that he was on his way to Alaska. He said he had picked up a book about nature hikes in California and that there were some pretty amazing trails around Fresno. Maybe we'll go on a hike when I get back, he said. That would be nice, I said. On Monday, December 2nd, Scott called in the early afternoon and told me he was back in Fresno, not far from my house. Are you ready for that hike? He asked. I gave him directions to my house and he got lost and called back and I guided him through the neighborhood. He arrived with some amaryllis and 2 bags of groceries. I bought a little something for dinner, he said. I hope that wasn't too presumptuous. I bought stuff for the hike too. Not presumptuous at all, I said. It sounds great. Where's the little one? He asked. At school, I said. I'm on my way to pick her up. You want to come with? I'd love to, he said, and he sounded genuinely excited. We put the groceries away and he had nice things to say about my place. I was living in Rolling Hills at the time, in Madera County, in an 800 square foot guest house. It had 1 bedroom and a tiled kitchen and a big, open living room. Ayana and I were very happy there. We went outside and transferred the car seat into his truck and went off to get Ayana. How was Alaska? I asked. Beautiful, he said. Look. He showed me a photograph of himself near a stream holding a fish. It was taken at such a long distance that it was hard to make out much detail. I'll have to take you there someday, he said. When we got to the school, we went inside together, and I briefly introduced him to the director, a close friend. Ayana was very happy to see me, as always, and when we got outside, she couldn't believe we were about to climb into a real truck. It's Scott's truck, I told her. Scott truck, Scott truck, Scott truck, she squealed. She's so incredibly cute, Scott said, glowing. Listen to her talk. My God, I thought, this guy is perfect. Scott picked her up to put her in her car seat, and Ayana took to him right away. He told her we were going on a hike, and she repeated the word, hike, hike, hike. We drove to nearby Albury. I'd been there many times before, but never with Ayana. And we walked along a trail to a place called Squaw's Leap. Ayana held both our hands all the way to the clearing, where we stopped to picnic on the snacks that Scott had brought along. He also had a blanket with him, and he laid it out on the grass. He seemed very happy. He couldn't stop grinning at me and Ayana. Look at me, he said. I've got a rigor mortis smile. It was very beautiful, but a little chilly, so we soon headed back. Ayana was tired, and Scott ended up carrying her most of the way. When we reached the truck, it was beginning to get dark, and we sat in the open cab to watch the stars come up. Let's see who can spot the very first star, Scott suggested, turning it into a competition. He won. A few stars later, Ayana was fast asleep. Scott talked about Thanksgiving and about families, and about how complicated they were. Some relatives you don't really like, but you have to get along with them because they're family, he said. I know what you mean, I said. Anyone who has a family knows. Scott managed a half smile. I got the impression that one of his relatives was rubbing him the wrong way, but I didn't want to pry. When the temperature began to drop, we got back inside the truck and went back to my place. The minute we walked in, Scott took me aside and told me that he had brought a little something for Ayana. I didn't know whether it was appropriate for me to give her a gift, so I thought I'd clear it with you, he said. I couldn't believe this guy. He was so considerate. I told him it was fine and thanked him for discussing it with me. If you had given her a present when you first met, I would have questioned your motives, I said. But since she already knows you and likes you, I'm sure it will be fine. He gave Ayana her present, and she eagerly tore the wrapping to shreds. There was a beautiful book inside, a richly detailed Christmas pop-up book, and Scott sat her on his lap and went through it with her. They looked really cute together. I was so happy to see this side of Scott. When Ayana began grabbing at the pop-ups, I worried she might rip them. I think we'd better keep that beautiful book away from her busy little hands, I said, at least until she's old enough to appreciate it. The next thing I knew, Scott had started preparing dinner. He made an elaborate seafood lasagna, As soon as the pan went into the oven, he opened a bottle of wine. He'd brought that too, and I took the cork from his hands. "I'm going to keep this," I said. "It feels like it means something." I told him that a friend of mine had a huge glass container at home filled with corks, and that he dated them and jotted down the names of the people he'd shared the bottle with. I thought it was a great idea. You could reach into your collection of corks and read the names and dates and think back to those particular evenings. I grabbed a pen. "I'm going to date this and put our names on it," I said. "Did you save the cork from our first bottle of champagne?" he asked. "No," I said. "I didn't think about it then." "That's okay," he said. "There are plenty of corks to come." I felt unusually comfortable around Scott, as if I'd known him for a very long time. I didn't feel I had to try to be anyone other than who I was, and it seemed as if he felt very much the same way. In a word, being with Scott was effortless. He spent the night. The next day, Tuesday, December 3rd, he called to say he was coming back into Fresno, and that he would probably be in town until morning. I had a client at 5:30 that evening, and Ayana had to be picked up by 6 p.m. I'd asked my mother to get her, but suddenly it occurred to me that Scott could pick her up. I realized I didn't know him very well, and that it seemed a little hasty, but I had seen them together, and I had been very pleasantly surprised at the way Ayana took to him. I had never asked anyone other than my mother to pick Ayana up at school. I'm an intensely protective parent. But for some strange reason, I didn't have the slightest hesitation with Scott. "Would you mind getting her for me?" I asked. "No, I'd be honored," he said. "I'm just worried she won't want to leave with me." "She'll leave with you," I assured him. "She likes you. I think she'll be excited to see you." I dropped the car seat and the key to my apartment at Ayana's school and went off to take care of my client. When I got home at around 6:45, I found Ayana in her high chair, happily eating dinner, and Scott nearby, busily chopping tomatoes for bruschetta. He had a glass of wine in his hand, and he poured one for me, and welcomed me home like it was the most natural thing in the world. "How'd it go at school?" I asked. "Great," he said. "I ran into your director friend, and she was very nice, but they still checked me out at the front office, and even asked for my ID. I thought that was very cool. I like the fact that they're so security conscious." I looked over at Ayana. She was happy and smiling. Then I looked back at Scott. This handsome man was beaming at me, and the place was filled with all sorts of wonderful, homey cooking smells. I felt like I had a family, a real family. After dinner, we went out to get a Christmas tree. My dad had said I could borrow his truck, but with Scott's Ford outside, I didn't need it. We bundled Ayana up and drove to the lot, and Scott picked a tree we all liked. I went to pay for it, and Ayana and Scott stood by the small bonfire, staring at the petting zoo, which was all lit up. The man who owned the place made change, and I joined them by the petting zoo, and before long the owner had wandered over and was smiling at us. I guess he thought we were a nice, happy family. "Your parents sure bundled you up nicely," he told Ayana. Scott and I looked at each other, but neither of us bothered to correct him. We took the tree home and set it up, and I went to get the ornaments out of the closet. I returned to find Scott draped over the love seat. It had been a long day, miles of road, hours of meetings, and he was tired. He looked so handsome and so comfortable, and he looked so much like he belonged, and I couldn't help myself. "Have you ever been married?" I asked. "No," he said. "Ever get close?" "No," he said. "Never." I didn't say anything, but my heart jumped a little. I was full of hope. I turned and began to decorate the tree, and Scott asked me to tell him stories about the ornaments. Even that impressed me, the fact that he knew that Christmas ornaments are often connected to stories. I told him that I'd been a preschool teacher for 7 years, and that most of my ornaments had been gifts from my students. My favorite was a little angel made out of a single clothespin. It had crinkly hair, a little cotton dress, and a tiny halo made of tinsel and wire. Ayana kept pulling at the ornaments, so I began to replace them with her collection of beanie babies. But she tried to pull these down too. Scott and I were laughing and having a good time. "Baby, baby," she said, yelping with delight. The way Scott looked at her and at me, and well, it's hard to describe. He seemed so happy and peaceful. I went over and cuddled with him on the love seat. He put his arm around me and pulled me closer to his warm body, and I felt as if I were about to melt. It had been a very long time since I'd felt that comfortable with a man. In fact, as I thought back on it, I realized that I hadn't been close to anyone for a long time. I really needed someone in my life, but I guess I'd been fighting it. Still, I was lonely, and I couldn't deny it. My friends always said, "Oh, Amber, your life is perfect. You have a Yana, you have a nice home, you have a great job, you have your independence. What more could you want?" I guess they were simply trying to be supportive. Or maybe their relationships weren't all that great and they envied my strength and independence. But I was tired of being strong and independent. I wanted someone to lean on, someone to come home to. I often took long walks, pushing Ayana along in the stroller, and I'd see couples here and there, walking hand in hand, and I would think, that's what I want. I want a partner. And I would have long conversations with God. I would say, "I know I have a lot to be thankful for. This beautiful daughter you've given me, this good life. And I know I shouldn't complain, but I can't help it. I'm lonely." And I swear that one night I heard God answering, not so much in a human voice. It was more of a feeling, really. And he said, "It's all right to feel lonely. You do need someone, Amber, and you'll find someone." It was only a short time later that Sean told me about Scott. "You know, I have never met anyone that I thought was good enough for you," she had told me. "But this guy is funny and smart and polite and good looking and a real gentleman, and he's looking to settle down." Sean had always been very protective of me. She had been around when my last serious relationship fell apart, and she had seen me literally curled up in pain, and she had been there when I pulled myself out of my depression and got back on my feet and turned my life around. But she knew I was lonely. "This guy is a great catch," she had told me. "If I wasn't in love with Tommy, I would definitely be seriously interested in Scott Peterson." She was right. Scott Peterson was a great catch. And at that moment, he was right there in my living room, in my love seat, pressed up next to me. It felt good and right and very promising. "What are you thinking?" I asked him. "Nothing," he said, smiling. "That I'm so comfortable. Your home is very relaxing. I'm enjoying watching you and Ayana. I'm happy." He yawned and looked at his watch. "I better get going," he noted. "I'll get a hotel for the night." "Don't be silly," I said. "Stay here." Shortly thereafter, Ayana curled up in her favorite spot in the living room and was soon peacefully asleep. Scott and I retired to the bedroom, and, perhaps because I was feeling hopeful about Scott, perhaps because I so much wanted things to work out between us, I found myself talking to him about trust. It's so much better to tell someone the truth, even if it's hard, than to tell a lie, I said, because even a tiny lie leads to mistrust. And once trust has been broken, it's hard to rebuild. "I agree with you," Scott said. "I find it a lot easier to deal with the truth, no matter how painful, than with the lies." I told him about an ex-boyfriend who had assured me that he wasn't into pornography and how I'd come to discover a huge stash of dirty magazines in his possession. I didn't approve of the magazines, but that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that he had lied to me about something so minor. If he could lie about that, he was capable of lying about anything at all. That's why, for me, I'd always rather know the truth, whatever it is, I told Scott. That's an unusual quality, Scott said. You're an amazing woman. After we made love, and long after he had fallen asleep, I found myself clinging to him. I didn't know what I'd done to deserve this wonderful man. He was smart, charming, sexy. He treated me with respect and kindness, and he was absolutely great with Ayana. I knew it was still early in the relationship, but I began to see us making a life together. Maybe I was rushing things, in my mind anyway, but I was almost certain I was rushing to a beautiful place. The next morning, while Scott was still asleep, I bathed and fed Ayana and took her to school. I returned to find him in the kitchen, his hair still damp from the shower. I think I really like you, I said, kissing him. I know I really like you, he replied. I had an art show to attend the following night at the Fresno Art Museum, and I asked Scott if he would come with me. By this time he had almost finished, dressing and was getting ready to leave. I realized I missed him already. I wish I could, he said. I have to go to San Francisco. He was going on business, and once that was taken care of, he had arranged to go boating with some friends. He said he didn't expect to be back in Fresno area before the weekend. I was eager to see him again, so I told him that Sean was having a party on December 11th for her fiancé, Tommy, and that I had a formal to go to do on December 14th, a fundraiser, and was hoping that he would be able to go to that too. He said he'd love to go to both. He accompanied me to my new office at American Body Works on 6th Street and helped me set up. We put up my certificates in some racks, and I could see that Scott was handy with tools. I know it's silly, but this impressed me too. We then set up my massage table, and I ended up giving Scott a massage. It was all very professional. I treated him as I treat all my clients. And when we were done, we went to the bank drive-thru, and Scott withdrew a large amount of money. He wanted to pay me for the massage, and I tried to refuse, but Scott insisted and even added a 20% tip. Then we went off to Whole Foods for lunch. I had the tortilla soup, which was great, and Scott told me that he loved to cook, and that he had this great big kitchen at home. I'd really enjoy cooking for you, he said. I'd like that too, I replied. As we left Whole Foods, I saw a big stack of pink lady apples, and I told them that when I was pregnant with Ayana, I had been wearing braces and I couldn't eat apples. I said that months later, when I finally bit into a caramel apple, it had been a big disappointment because it wasn't a pink lady. After lunch, we went our separate ways, and all I could think about was how much I enjoyed Scott's company. On the 5th, I went to the art opening and ran into my friend, Saki Vincent. She was a client and a graphic designer and a single mom like me, and we had become pretty good friends. I told her all about Scott and admitted that I was pretty smitten, which I guess was obvious. I couldn't seem to keep the excitement out of my voice. You deserve someone good in your life, she said. I hope he's the one. The next day, December 6th, Sean was discussing business with a colleague and happened to mention Scott by name. The colleague knew the name. He had once interviewed with Scott for a job. He told Sean that Scott was married and lived in Modesta. Sean was sure he was mistaken, that it must be a different Scott Peterson. But he insisted. I'm telling you, it's the same Scott Peterson. I met the guy. As soon as she got off the phone, Sean dialed Scott's number and got through and confronted him. Tell me I did not set my best friend up on a date with a married man, she said, already angry. What? I just got off the phone with someone who says he knows you. He says you're married and lives in Modesta. That's crazy. It must be another Scott Peterson. I don't believe you, Sean said. I'm going to look into this. Amber is my best friend, and I don't want to see her get hurt. Sean got off the phone and logged onto the internet and gained access to Sacramento County records. Within minutes, she discovered that Scott Peterson was indeed married and that he did indeed live in Modesto. She called him back, very angry now, and told him what she'd learned. Scott didn't answer right away, and a moment later she heard him crying. "Scott, are you still there? What's going on?" "I'm sorry," he said, still crying. "I'm sorry I lied to you. It's just, I lost my wife. It's been very hard for me. I haven't fully dealt with it yet." Sean was horrified. She didn't know what to say. She stammered an apology of her own. "Oh my God, Sean, I'm so sorry, Scott. I had no idea." "Please," Scott said, "I beg you, don't tell Amber. I really care for Amber and I don't want to screw this up. Let me tell her myself. I want to tell her in person." "Absolutely," Sean replied. "That's fine. I just didn't want Amber to get hurt. That was the reason I confronted you. Amber isn't looking for someone to have sex with. She's looking for someone with whom she can spend her life." "That is totally what I'm looking for," he said. "I mean it. I'm not going to blow this, Sean. Please, trust me. Let me tell Amber myself." Sean decided to respect Scott's wishes. He sounded genuine and genuinely torn, and for good reason. The poor guy had lost his wife. Sean had wanted to ask him how he had lost his wife. To illness, in an accident, to another man, but it didn't seem appropriate, and she imagined she'd find out eventually, probably from me. I didn't know this at the time, of course, just as I didn't know that 2 days later, on December 8th, Scott was looking through the classifieds for a fishing boat, nor that on the same day he was scouring the internet for information on currents in the San Francisco Bay and began negotiating for the boat. The following day, Scott purchased the fishing boat for $1,400, then visited a sport fishing site to determine what kind of fish were in season. That same day, Scott came in to see me at home. This is how I recalled the visit for the police several weeks later, when they came to my apartment. I was pretty nervous, which I know they understood, and it showed. "So, he's wearing a blue suit and he had his international rotary pin on, and I said hi and how are you? And he's like, not good. And I said, what? And he was just like, I really need to talk to you. And I said, okay." He was very upset, very distraught about something he had done that was very devastating possibly to what could be a beautiful relationship. And that he was just like, "I need you to come in here." He moved the chairs. He sat in that chair there. I was sitting there. He was sitting there and was pretty mad, was up pacing a little bit and said, "Okay, well, what? I couldn't understand. Well, what is it?" And I said, I really would just it'd be so much easier if you just hated me and you didn't want to see me again. And I'd understand. And I just hate myself so much right now. Then he talked to me about lying. And then he goes, and I just had such a horrible weekend this week. And it wasn't fun for anybody because I had this on my mind. And I was like, what? And I'm holding his hand and he was crying. His stomach kept churning and he was having trouble swallowing and tears were pouring down out of his eyes. And he said, "I lied to you about you asked me if I'd been married, and I have, but it's in my past, and it's so hard for me because I've had such a hard time dealing with, and I said, okay, and I'm thinking, well, she's passed, And he goes, I haven't said very much, but obviously that she's not with me. And he goes, I wanted to be able to talk to you about this. And I was going to talk to you about this when I came back from Europe. But this was on my mind. And I had to let it all out. And I was like, okay. And I go, I'm sorry. This was so hard for you to tell me. And I thank you for sharing this with me. And there will be a time for you, to share more. and he's like taking breaths and he's having trouble swallowing. He's like, "You're not mad?" And I said, "How can I be mad if something, is, how can I possibly, that's understandable if you have a loss." And he goes, and he said, "This will be the first holidays without her." It was terrible. There was one point early on, just as he began to talk, when I said, "Geez, Scott, for a moment there, I thought you were going to tell me you were married." And he said, "No, no, no." And he kept asking me if I was mad. And he said, "You have no idea how hard this is for me. I never talk about her with anyone. When I meet new people, I act like my marriage never ever happened." I was curious, of course. Who wouldn't be? But I was also concerned. When he said that this would be his first holiday without her, I realized that the loss was very recent, and I wondered whether he should take more time to grieve. I was thinking about him, not about myself, and I asked him, "Are you ready for a relationship with me?" "God, yes," he said. I didn't see Scott again for several days, and I was feeling confused and a little fearful. He had lied to me, and it was hurtful. But I could understand why he had lied, and I had no right to stand in judgment of him. So I worked at putting it behind me. After all, he was the one who had suffered an unimaginable loss. It was my job to be there for him, and to be as understanding as humanly possible. That following evening, December 10th, Ayana was running across the living room when she tripped on the rug and fell against the stereo cabinet, cutting her head open. There was blood gushing from her forehead, and I grabbed a towel and called the landlord to ask him to take us to the hospital. It was only 5 minutes away, but my car was a stick shift, and I knew I couldn't manage it. He was home, luckily, and we rushed over to Valley Children's Hospital, where the doctors stitched her right up. I called Scott from the hospital and reached his voicemail, but I didn't leave a message. I didn't want to upset him unnecessarily. Then I took Ayana home and comforted her and put her to bed. Scott came over the following afternoon and behaved like a perfect angel. He was incredibly sweet to Ayana and even changed her bandage and later asked me how I had handled the accident. I mean, as a mother, to see your daughter bleeding like that. How do you handle something like that? It must be incredibly hard to see your daughter in pain. And I said, "You don't even think about it. You just do what needs to be done. I guess it's maternal instinct." That was the night of the party for Sean's fiancée, but we also had the formal to think about. So while Ayana was at school, we went down to the Fashion Fair Mall to rent a tuxedo for Scott. We went home and I went to get Ayana and we hung out. And when it was time for the party, I slipped into a pair of blue jeans. Scott went in casual pants and a blue shirt. I distinctly remember what he wore because I saw him in the same shirt several weeks later on the news, when the networks were busy reporting on his missing wife, Lacey. One of the photographs showed Scott and Lacey together, and Scott was wearing that very same shirt. Just before we left for the party, I called Sean and asked her if she could try to snap a photograph of Scott, Ayana, and me. I asked her to be discreet, however, because the photograph was going to be the centerpiece of a Christmas ornament I intended to make for Scott. "You got it," she said. "Thanks," I said. "I really appreciate this." The party was at Sean's house, about half an hour away, and there was plenty of other children there. It was lots of fun, and everyone was taking pictures. But the battery on Sean's camera died, and I never got the shots I wanted. Instead, there was a photograph of Scott sitting in a chair, holding a beer with me leaning toward him. When Scott later went on trial for murder, that photograph was entered as evidence. That night, however, I was with a different Scott altogether. The Scott at my side was outgoing and personable and charming and very much able to take care of himself, and clearly everyone liked him. I didn't get much of a chance to talk to Sean. She was too busy being a good hostess. But at one point, I got the feeling she had something to tell me. It was the way she was looking at me. What? I asked her at one point. But before she could answer, Tommy came by and dragged her away. When the party was over, Scott came back to my place and again spent the night. The next day, December 13th, Sean came in for a massage, and while I was working on her, I sensed a small level of discomfort. I had a hunch she was keeping something from me, and I had asked if she had forgotten to tell me something about Scott. She was very upset, and the truth came pouring out of her. "I found out completely by accident," she said, "and I really wanted to tell you, but Scott was crying, and he begged me to let you tell him about his wife himself. So I'm sorry. I feel like I've lied to my best friend." I told her I totally understood, and that I wasn't really mad at her. Sean is a good person, and this was an unusual situation. I understood why Scott had been reluctant to discuss his loss with either of us. He was still grieving. Sean understood this too, but she wasn't happy about it. "He lied to both of us," she said. "I know," I said, "but there were extenuating circumstances." "I'm aware of that," she said, "but it still bothers me. You should be careful." I asked her if he had told her how his wife had died, and she shook her head. "Did he tell you?" she asked. "No," I said. On December 14th, the night of the fundraiser, I took Ayana to my mother's house and went back to my place to wait for Scott. I was trying not to think about the conversation with Sean, but it still gnawed at me. She had found out about Scott's past by accident, and Scott had only come to me with the truth after she'd confronted him. This didn't exactly inspire confidence. Scott arrived with 12 red roses. "I hope you have plenty of vases," he said, and he suddenly pulled another 24 roses from his duffel bag, where he'd covered them with a coat. He had also bought 2 bottles of champagne. As I began to put the roses in a vase, he took a single stem and set it on the table. "Why'd you do that?" I asked. "I'm glad you asked," he replied. "While I was in San Francisco, this one rose was all I could think about the entire time." He snipped off the stem and began rubbing the petals against my skin, and he began to kiss me. It was very hot, and the petals were now circling my breasts. But it was time for us to get ready. Plus, I had some things on my mind, and, much as I tried to keep my thoughts in check, I couldn't help myself. "Listen, Scott," I said, "I have something to ask you." "What's that, sweetie?" "I talked to Sean. She told me how she found out about you being married. I was just wondering, would you have told me the truth if Sean had never found out?" "Oh, sweetheart," he protested. "Of course I would have. You know I would have. I was going to tell you everything when I got back from Europe. It's just been very hard for me is all." I wasn't looking at him when I posed the question. I didn't want to put him on the spot, and I didn't want to be confrontational, so I'd made every effort to sound casual. I hadn't wanted to catch him off guard, and I wasn't watching for it. On the other hand, weeks later, when I thought back on it, I realized that he must have been ready for it. After all, Sean was my best girlfriend, and he probably assumed that she couldn't possibly have kept the secret to herself. "I'm so sorry," he said. I was looking at him now, and his eyes glistened with tears. "I never meant to hurt you." He kept going on, and I felt very badly for him, so I did the only thing I could do. I forgave him. The fact is, it was easy to understand why he hadn't told me, and it made perfect sense. I'd never gone through such a monumental loss. I had no idea how it must have felt, nor how I would have dealt with a similar situation in my own life. I didn't want to stand in judgment, and I wanted to believe him, so I simply accepted his explanation. Then I told him I had only brought it up because I wanted to be sure about him. "Can I trust you with my heart?" I asked him. "You know the answer to that already." "No, I don't," I said. "That's why I'm asking." "You know," he said, "I live a certain lifestyle, and I can see you living that lifestyle too. When I get back from Europe, I need to make some decisions. Can you say yes to me without question?" I didn't understand why he refused to answer me directly, so I repeated my question. "Scott, can I trust you with my heart?" And he answered exactly as he'd answered before. "You know the answer to that already." It was very tough for me. I liked Scott, and I wanted a relationship. But I was still worried about his state of mind. He had such a charming way about him, yet he seemed oddly reluctant to answer some of the simplest questions. Then again, I knew he was in pain, and that the loss was recent. I wanted to be forgiving for both our sakes. It had been a long time since I'd been genuinely interested in a man, and I was genuinely interested in Scott. I didn't want to get carried away, though. I wanted to proceed with caution. "I hate to bring this up again," I said, "but are you really sure you're ready for a relationship?" Scott didn't answer. He kissed me instead. By this time it was getting late, and I needed to start dressing for the formal. Scott told me he had something to do in the kitchen, and to please not come in. I was having trouble fixing my hair, but he came to take a look and said it looked beautiful and to leave it as it was. "As long as you feel that way," I said, moved. "That's all that matters." He went back to the kitchen and returned a short time later with something behind his back. "What are you hiding there?" I asked. He showed me, and I almost couldn't believe it. "Is that a pink lady caramel apple?" I asked. "It's my first attempt," he said. "I hope you like it." He'd rigged up a double boiler and unwrapped the individual caramels and made it from scratch, the way it was supposed to be done. It was such a generous thing to do, yet he acted as if it was nothing. I was really moved by his thoughtfulness. We shared the pink lady, and Scott opened one of the bottles of champagne. He was in his rented tux, and I was in a red strapless evening gown, and I thought we looked nice. "There's going to be a lot of people I know at this fundraiser," I said. "How should I introduce you?" "I don't know." "Well, are you seeing anyone else?" "I'm not seeing anyone else. You're the only one I call sweetheart. I'm completely monogamous." "So, would I be safe to call you my boyfriend?" "I think that would be totally appropriate, don't you?" "Yes," I said, smiling. I felt good about this. I guess I was looking for clarification, and he had provided it. The relationship seemed to be moving along, but I didn't want to be presumptuous. I smiled at him. "That makes everything a lot easier," he said. I said. We were supposed to pick up Saki, but she was running late, so we went to Casanova's, a local restaurant, for champagne and appetizers. Then we went to get Saki and returned to the restaurant. At one point, she and I disappeared into the restroom, and I told her about the rose petals and the caramel apple. "He's really cute," she said, but she didn't gush or anything. I got the feeling she was being cautious, or that maybe she saw something in him that I didn't see. When we got back to the table, Scott was grinning and acting all full of himself. "Thank goodness you're back," he said. "While you girls were gone, the waiter was hitting on me." "He was not," I said. "Was too," he insisted, pointing out the waiter in question. "Did it bother you?" "No," he said. "It's totally flattering when another guy finds you attractive." I thought that was a little odd. We left and stopped to pick up some film for Saki's camera, then drove over to the formal at the World Sports Cafe in northeast Fresno. There was a full bar and people were dancing and the music was loud. At one point, Scott went outside to make a call on his cell phone. When I went to look for him later, he was handing out my new business card and telling everyone I was the best massage therapist in town. One other thing I remember about that night is how strange it felt to describe Scott as my boyfriend. Even as the word tripped off my tongue, boyfriend, it was hard to get used to. It had been a very long time since I'd had an actual boyfriend. So, yes, it was strange, but it certainly felt good. We had a couple of drinks and danced a little, though it was hard to dance in that dress. And later, Scott had a cigar. He loved cigars and had his own cigar cutter. Finally, we called it a night and went back to Saki's place. She had left her camera in his truck, and she wanted to take some pictures. So we went inside and posed and had a little fun. Saki and I were a bit tipsy, and we were laughing so hard that at one point we actually fell to the ground. We had a great time taking those pictures. My favorite was the one of Scott and me in front of Saki's Christmas tree. It was a wonderful evening. When we returned to my place, Scott and I got careless and were intimate without protection. Scott apologized, and before I knew it, we were having our first serious conversation about children. I told him I had tried birth control pills, but that they didn't agree with me. He said I shouldn't worry, and announced that he'd been thinking about having a vasectomy. I was pretty surprised by this. Scott, you're so young. That's a pretty radical decision. Don't you want a child of your own? No, he replied. I don't really feel I need a biological child, assuming that you and I are together. The one child I could see in my life would be Ayana, and I would raise her as my own. That bothered me on two fronts. First, I didn't understand how Scott, at age 30, could be so certain he didn't want children. That was a pretty big decision, and potentially irreversible. Part of me assumed that maybe Scott hadn't met the right woman, but I didn't tell him so. The other reason it troubled me is that I definitely wanted more children. I shared this with Scott. I told him that I wanted to experience pregnancy in a joyous manner, with someone I loved. This was not something I had experienced with Ayana. There had been no one there to share the joy of listening to my baby's heartbeat for the first time. No one next to me as the baby kicked away. No man at my side for those first sonograms. Still, I got beyond that soon enough. I loved being pregnant. I had a textbook pregnancy. Everything went flawlessly. And when Ayana finally arrived, she changed my world forever. My life began anew. She was my little blessing, a girl from God. Scott brought his face close to mine and studied me with great tenderness. You are beautiful, Amber, he said. And when I say you're beautiful, I'm talking about the inside too. Early that morning, Scott went off to get ready for a business trip to New Mexico and Arizona. That's what he told me anyway. The fact is, he was going home to his wife, Lacey. He was supposed to cook dinner for Lacey and her mother, Sharon Russia, and for Sharon's husband, Ron Gransky. I didn't know who these people were, nor that they even existed, but I'd know about them before long. On December 16th, Scott left a message on my answering machine. Hey sweetheart, Scott here. I'm driving to the gym to do my weekly 5-minute workout. I'll try to give you a call tomorrow. I loved the sound of his voice, and I played the message over several times. It was so sweet. There was something wonderful and heartening about my businessman boyfriend calling to check in, to let me know what he was up to. I began to think that Scott and I might actually have a real future together. And when I sat down to finish my Christmas cards, I decided to enclose the picture of Scott and me. It was the one we had taken at Saki's house, right after the party. I wanted everyone to know about Scott. I wasn't going to hold back. I didn't hear from Scott again until December 19th, when he said he was calling from New Mexico. On December 20th, we spoke only very briefly, and Scott said he'd call back. I didn't hear from him. Apparently, he wasn't out of town at all, but busy buying fishing lures, a rod, a reel, and a fishing license. And when he finally called on December 21st, I was relieved to hear his voice. "I'd really like to hear from you," I said. "You know how much I miss you." "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't think my cell phone works too well in New Mexico, but I'll be back in Sacramento tomorrow and we can talk then." He called the next day to say he was in Sacramento and that he would be leaving for Maine soon. "Then I'm off to Europe." "I miss you already," I said. "Me too," he said. He was going to be gone for almost a month. And, much as I hated birth control pills, this was the right time to start taking them. Scott told me not to bother. He knew I didn't respond well to the pill, and he again mentioned this business about a vasectomy. "Ayana is enough for me," he said, echoing his earlier remark. "I would raise her as my own." At that point, I began to get choked up. "This is such a big step," I said. "We need to discuss it." "You're right," Scott said. "Why don't we talk about this when I get back? Maybe we can see a doctor together." I thought this was both generous and thoughtful. Here was a man who was willing to look at things from my point of view, not simply dismiss them out of hand. I then asked how I could get in touch with him while he was gone. "I'm getting a P.O. box in Modesto." "What good does that do? How will they get an email to you?" "It's sort of like a courier service," he explained. "I let them know where I am and they can ship things to me practically overnight." This didn't sound right to me. Why would a man who lived in Sacramento get a post office box in Modesto? But I let it slide. What did I know about courier services and overseas mail delivery? Not much, clearly. And my goal was to be able to get in touch with him. I had 2 Christmas gifts for him. One was a glass ornament with our photograph inside. I decorated it with gold foil and the words, "Merry Christmas 2002. The whole thing was wrapped in blue foil, and I'd enclosed a note. "To my love, from your love." It was sitting on my kitchen counter, ready for mailing. The other gift was a black chenille scarf, which I was crocheting myself, but wasn't quite done. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. When I got off the phone, I realized that he never said he loved me. Not in person and not on the phone. Then again, I had never told him I loved him either. Did I love him? I wasn't sure, though I felt I was certainly moving in that direction. And he cared for me. I could feel that. The way he treated me, the way he treated my daughter. He was a tender, caring person. I figured we were both being cautious, but that was as it should be. Good things take time.